Hello and welcome back to my crafting channel.
I have been sewing my own clothes for many years. In previous episodes on this channel, I have shown you how to sew skirts based on your own body measurements. Sometimes I create my own patterns based on my measurements, and sometimes I use ready-made patterns. I have often heard people say that they would like to sew, but that reading a pattern seems too difficult. I wanted to show you how to sew a garment step by step from a ready-made pattern for a long time. Today we are going to sew this shirt from Selfmade. The pattern number is 23156, and with it you can sew this shirt or two different variations of a shirt dress. If you want to sew this exact shirt, you can watch this video to see how to do it. Even if you don't want to sew this specific shirt, I think the video will be useful, as most shirts are sewn in a similar way. Many of the techniques I will cover also apply to sewing in general.
Before we start, I would like to make clear that I'm not sponsored by Selfmade, and this is not an advertisement for them.
Since I'm using a ready-made pattern, I will follow their instructions so you can see how to follow a sewing guide.
I will also share some of my own useful tips for sewing. But now, let's get started!
When using a ready-made pattern, the manufacturer usually recommends which types of fabric are suitable for that specific pattern. In this case, they recommend poplin, thin linen, viscose, and more. I have chosen a cotton fabric that works well for shirts. The first thing you should always do before using the fabric is to wash it. Fabrics can shrink quite a bit, and it's frustrating to spend time sewing a garment only to have it shrink in the first wash. Therefore, my recommendation is to always wash all fabrics you plan to use. You should also iron the fabric before you use it. The pattern I am using today comes only in the size you choose to buy. Sometimes you get a pattern with several sizes, and you have to trace your size onto a separate pattern paper if you don't want to cut the original. That is not the case here. Selfmade also laser cuts all patterns, so you don't even need to cut them out. You can just pull out the pattern by lifting a corner of each piece. Before I pull out the pattern pieces, I check which ones I need specifically for the shirt, as I don't need the parts for the shirt dresses. Once I have pulled out the shirt pieces, I place them on the fabric. Almost all patterns, not just this from Selfmade, usually include a layout suggestion to get the most out of your fabric. This means that I can see how they recommend laying out each piece. Unfortunately, I can't use that recommendation in this case because my fabric is narrower in width. Therefore, I have to lay out the pattern pieces to fit my fabric. When sewing, it's always important to place the pattern pieces on the grain line, which is the lengthwise direction of the fabric, not the crosswise direction. There is usually an arrow on each pattern piece that shows which direction to lay that piece. It's crucial that you follow this for a good result. If you are unsure what the length and the width of the fabric are, the fabric usually has selvages along the width. The selvages are the finished edges of the fabric running parallel to the grain line created during manufacturing. They are usually slightly different in texture or color from the main fabric, and sometimes they have printed information about the fabric. Many patterns are only for the finished measurements of the garment, and you need to add seam allowance yourself, that small extra amount of fabric left outside the seam line when joining pieces. Typically, most patterns use a seam allowance of 1 or 1.5 centimeters. For hems, at the bottom of the garment, you might need to add 3 or 4 centimeters. You would then need to add the seam allowance to all edges of the pattern pieces before cutting it out. However, in this specific pattern, Selfmade has already included the seam allowance. This means you can cut out the fabric directly. I pin all the pattern pieces to my fabric along the grain line and cut out each piece. Some pattern pieces only require one cut, while others may require 2 or more identical cuts. This is usually indicated on the pattern or in the instructions. For this shirt, for example, I need 2 sleeves and 2 yokes, etc. I can choose to cut these pieces from double-folded fabric or cut out each piece, remove the pattern paper, and lay it out on the fabric again to cut an identical piece. I have chosen to cut all pieces from a single layer of fabric and therefore have to cut some pieces twice. If you choose to cut from a single layer, it's important to remember that some pieces need to be mirror images. For example, a right sleeve and a left sleeve are always mirror images of each other. If you use a single layer of fabric, you will need to flip the pattern paper when cutting out a piece that needs to be mirrored. If you cut from double-folded fabric, you don't need to worry about this, and the pieces will be mirrored automatically. When using a pattern, you need to transfer all markings and sewing lines from the pattern to the fabric. You do this with a marking pen, a chalk, or with a tracing wheel and a carbon paper for fabric. I will be using a tracing wheel and a carbon paper. You must always transfer all important markings and darts, but marking all the seam lines is optional. If you don't want to, you can just measure the distance between the seam and the edge and use that distance as your sewing allowance. However, I usually mark every line because it gives you a more precise result when sewing. Once I have cut and marked all pieces, it's time to cut out the interfacing for the parts that need it. Many patterns usually recommend how thick the interfacing needs to be, based on the types of fabric they suggest. Otherwise, a good rule of thumb is that the interfacing should be about the same thickness as the fabric. If you must choose between an interfacing that is slightly thicker than the fabric and one that is slightly thinner, my recommendation is to always choose the thinner interfacing. There are many different types of interfacing to choose from. I have chosen one that is sticky on one side and which you iron onto the wrong side of the fabric. Every pattern usually specifies which parts needs interfacing. In this self-made pattern, they have included a visual image showing which pieces require interfacing. There, you can see that interfacing is needed for the cuffs, the upper collar, the collar stand, and the front placket facing, where I will sew the buttonholes and the buttons. Selfmade has also ensured that all pattern pieces that require interfacing are dotted. To determine how much interfacing is needed for the shirt's front edges, I measure the dotted section of the front piece both in length and width. Then I draw those exact measurements directly onto the interfacing. The other pattern pieces that need interfacing
do not need to be measured since the entire piece requires it. So I can place those directly on the interfacing and cut them out. I can lay out either the pattern pieces or the fabric pieces on the interfacing. It's important that the right side of the fabric is facing the sticky part of the interfacing. Otherwise, you might end up cutting out mirrored interfacing pieces that don't fit the fabric. I then iron the sticky side of the interfacing onto the wrong side of the fabric. And now it's time to start sewing.
We will sew a bust dart according to the markings we made on each front piece. I fold the front piece so that the two seam lines lie on top of each other. It can sometimes be tricky to fold the seam lines aligned exactly all the way, and therefore I always take a pin and stick it down along the marked seam line on both sides. If I insert a pin into the seam line on one side of the fabric and it comes out on the seam line on the other side, I know the dart is positioned correctly at that point. I then place the pin along the seam line, and if it comes out exactly on the seam line on both sides of the fabric is in a good position there too. I do this in several places along the seam line to ensure it is straight. Once I know that the two seam lines of the bust dart align perfectly along the fold, I can pin the bust dart. I pin perpendicularly across the seam line instead of parallel of it. This is because you can sew over pins that are perpendicular to the seam line but not over pins that are parallel to it. I always start sewing a bust dart from the wider side at the edge of the fabric. I secure the thread with back stitching and sew all the way. When I reach the end of the dart, the narrow pointed part, I do not secure with back stitching. Instead, I sew right off the edge, stopping just outside the edge. Then I tie the two thread tails together with 2 or 3 knots. After sewing the bust darts, I press it upwards from the wrong side. I press the front edge 1 centimeter towards the wrong side and then another 2.5 centimeter towards the wrong side. This way, the raw edge is enclosed within the fabric. This means it doesn't need to be zigzagged. A rule of thumb in sewing is that edges enclosed within the fabric never need to be zigzagged or overlocked. All raw edges that are not enclosed in the fabric, however, need to be zigzagged or overlocked to prevent the edge from fraying. In accordance with the instructions, I stitched down the front placket with the 2.3 centimeter seam allowance.
This is what it looks like after I have stitched the front edges onto the front pieces.
I place one yoke piece on the back piece, right side against wrong side, and pin it. This might seem strange because you often sew right sides together, but in this case it's correct because we have 2 yoke pieces. I stitch the yoke to the back piece with a 0.7 centimeter seam allowance.
This is what it looks like after I have sewn the first yoke right side against wrong side. As you can see, I drew a black line with a washable fabric pen along the entire stitching line. I did this before sewing to ensure that I would maintain a precise 0.7 centimeters seam allowance when joining the yoke and the back piece.
Then I place the second yoke piece on the other side of the back piece and pin it. The back piece is now sandwiched between the yokes. I stitch this second yoke and the back piece together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once both yokes are attached, I turn them into place and press. I sew a top stitch over the bottom edges of the yokes where they meet the back piece. I sew this top stitch according to the instructions with a 0.2 centimeter seam allowance.
This is what the yokes look like after I have top stitched them, having sewn them together with the back piece.
To keep the yokes in place, I sew them together along the raw edges, meaning around the other parts of the yokes, with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance.
This is what it looks like after I have sewn the yokes together along all the raw edges.
I pin the shoulder edges of the yokes and the front pieces together. Then I sew the yokes to the front pieces. I then zigzag the raw edges so they don't fray. As I mentioned before, all raw edges that are not enclosed in a seam need to be zigzagged. If you have an overlock machine, you can overlock instead of zigzagging. I then press the seam allowance on both shoulder seams towards the back piece. Finally, I sew a top stitch on the yoke with a 0.2 centimeter seam allowance following the sewing instructions.
This is what it looks like after I have top stitched the yoke. Here you can see images from both the right side and the wrong side.
I pin and sew the upper color and the under color together. According to the instructions, the upper color should be eased in slightly. After sewing the colors together, I clip the corners. I clip close to the seam, but absolutely must not cut into the seam. If I want, I can also grade the rest of the color seam allowance to make it less bulky. I then turn the color out to the right side and press. I then sew a top stitch on the stitched parts of the color with a 0.2 centimeter seam allowance. After that, I sew the raw edge of the color together with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. I continue by pressing the bottom edge of one of the color stands 1 centimeter towards the wrong side. I then place the upper color between the markings on the color stand that is not pressed. I pin the color stand and sew the collar to the color stand with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. Once the collar is attached to the color stand, it's time to attach the collar to both color stands. I lay the second collar stand on the collar so that the collar is sandwiched between the two collar stands. I pin it and sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance.
Even though it looks faster in the video, I sewed the collar to the collar stands quite slowly. Since I am sewing through 4 layers of fabric, it's good to be a little slower to prevent anything from puckering while sewing. This is what it looks like after the collar is sewn to both collar stands. I clip the seam allowance in the curve and I am careful to clip close to the seam but never into the seam. This is what it looks like when I clip. I then turn it out to the right side and press the collar and the collar stand. And this is what it looks like when I press.
I place the right side of the collar stand against the wrong side of the shirt neckline. I pin and sew the collar stand.
I want to remind you again that it can be a good idea to sew a little slower, even though it looks like I am sewing fast in the video. When sewing a collar stand to a shirt, the fabric section you are attaching it to is curved, and it's good to be a bit slower there.
This is what it looks like after I have sewn the inner part of the collar stand to the shirt. Before I also sew the outer collar stand to the shirt, I press the seam allowance towards the collar stand. This way, the seam allowance will be hidden inside the collar stand. Now it's time to attach the outer side of the collar stand to the outside of the shirt. I pin the collar stand and make sure that the collar stand extends far enough down onto the shirt that the seam I previously sewed is hidden. I pin the collar stand to the shirt and stitch it from the right side with a 0.2 centimeter seam allowance. This way, the raw edge of the collar stand is enclosed within the collar stand. I want to remind you again to sew slowly. This time we are going to sew a seam that will be visible on the outside of the shirt, and it is sewn with only a 0.2 centimeter seam allowance. We must also ensure that we cover the seam allowance we pressed inside the shirt. Therefore, it's really important to sew slowly. It's better to take your time while sewing than to have to rip stitches afterward if something goes wrong. Ripping often takes much longer than sewing correctly from the start. Here you can see when the collar stand is sewn onto the shirt, and here is also some close-ups of it. According to the sewing instructions, you should now sew a top stitch around the rest of the collar stand with a 0.2 centimeter seam allowance. Unfortunately, this was something I forgot and did not discover until the shirt was finished. I still recommend that you sew this top stitch, as top stitching is what makes clothes look well made. That is why I am showing you where you should sew the top stitch. I pin the front pieces right sides together and sew the side seams. Since the edges will be raw, they need to be zigzagged or overlocked. I zigzag the edges and press them towards the back piece of the shirt. I cut the placket opening on the sleeve up to the marking. I fold the placket first 0.3 centimeters towards the wrong side and press. Then I fold it another 0.3 centimeters towards the wrong side and press again. This way the placket edges is also enclosed in the fold. Here you see me measuring 3 millimeters and folding. Since this is such a small measurement, I am careful when measuring to make sure it is correct. I pin and sew the sleeve placket. I will then stitch off the corner of the placket. I fold the sleeve so the plackets are aligned. Then I sew off towards the edge. When I reach the edge, I do not secure it with backstitching. Instead, I do exactly as I did with the dart. I sew just over the edge of the fabric and then tie the threads together 2 or 3 times. Here you can see an image of when I have sewn off the corner of the placket. I then form the marked pleat at the bottom of the sleeve. On this pattern, this is marked as a marking X, and I align marking X with marking O. The opening of the pleat should face the placket. I stitch across the pleat to hold it in place with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Next, I sew the sleeve seam and zigzag it. I press the seam allowance towards the back of the sleeve. I fold the cuff wrong side against wrong side and press it. I then press 1 centimeter in one of the long side towards the wrong side. It's important to remember that we have a right cuff and a left cuff. I then fold the cuff right side against right side and sew the short sides together. Here you can see an image of when I have sewn the short sides of the cuffs together. I clip the corners of the cuff, turn it out to the right side and press. Now it's time to attach the cuffs to the sleeves. I place the right side of the cuff against the wrong side of the sleeve. The marking on the cuff should align with the sleeve seam. I pin the cuff and sew it on. The cuff is now attached to the wrong side of the sleeve. Once the cuff is sewn on, I turn it into place. I then press the seam allowance towards the cuff. Now it's time to also attach the cuff to the right side of the sleeve. I pin the cuff, then I stitch the cuff from the right side with a 0.2 cm seam allowance. As you can see, this way of attaching the cuff is similar to how we attached the collar earlier. This is what the cuffs look like when they are sewn on. Finally, I sew a top stitch around the rest of the cuff with a 0.2 cm seam allowance. The cuffs are now completely finished. I pin the sleeve right side against right side to the shirt armhole. In accordance with the sewing instructions, I make sure the sleeve seam matches the side seam. The notch on the sleeve cap matches the notch on the yoke, and the notch on the sleeve matches the notch on the front piece. The sewing instructions indicate that the sleeve is slightly larger than the armhole opening, and this is intentional to give the sleeve the correct fit. Therefore, the sleeve needs to be eased in slightly when sewing it on. Once I have sewn on the sleeve, I zigzag the raw edges and press them towards the sleeve. Here you see the shirt after both sleeves have been sewn on. I fold in and press the bottom edge 2 times 0.07 centimeters towards the wrong side. By pressing the edge twice, the raw edge is enclosed within the fabric. I pin the pressed edge and sew it down. Now we have reached the very last step, sewing the buttonholes and attaching the buttons. Since we folded in the front placket and the cuffs, we no longer see the markings for the buttonholes. We therefore take out the pattern again and place it so that it exactly matches the shirt we have sewn. This allows us to see where the buttonholes should be placed. I mark this with an erasable marking pen. You choose the size of your buttons, and I have chosen slightly smaller buttons than the buttons drawn as round circles on the pattern. This doesn't really matter because the important thing is that the center of my button lands in the center of where the button is marked on the pattern. That way the distance between the buttons will still be correct. Now it's time to sew the buttonholes. On my machine, which is an older Bernina, this is done by setting the machine to sew buttonholes. Then I sew them in several steps according to how buttonholes are sewn on my specific sewing machine. Perhaps it's done differently on your machine. Therefore, it might be a good idea to read the instructions for your sewing machine if you don't know how to sew a buttonhole. Regarding the size of a buttonhole, the length should be approximately button diameter plus button thickness plus 1 to 2 millimeters. My buttons are about 11 millimeters in diameter, and the thickness is about 2 millimeters. This means my buttonholes should be about 14 to 15 millimeters long. Once I have sewn my buttonholes, I take a seam ripper and cut open the fabric between the outer edges of the buttonholes. It's important to be careful when cutting so you don't cut open the stitching of the buttonhole. The very last step is to sew on the buttons. I usually do this by hand with a double thread to make sure the button stays securely in place. Here's what the shirt looks like when it's finished.
Friday clock just hit 5. Shake the week off, feel alive. Jeans ripped at the knee, lipstick stains on whiskey. Neon lights through Uber glass, laughing at our working class. Monday's problems fade to gray, weekend vibes won't obey. Weekend vibes in stereo, baseline deep, let's move slow. Every worry left behind, dancing fools but hearts aligned.
I really hope you liked the video, and if you did, please consider to like, share and subscribe, and don't forget to click that notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming content on my channel. Thank you for watching, but for now, bye! Have fun sewing!